We're now about 2 weeks into Affliction League, and this is a time where normally the meta would be pretty well solidified. But unfortunately, or more accurately, awesomely, GGG dropped over 100 new gems, the Transfigured skills. So the meta's a long way off of solved. In fact, I expect there's going to be new skills that fell through the cracks trickling out over the next few leagues. I'll be doing my best to find them, but I'm sure I'm going to miss something somewhere. Or maybe there's going to be a unique item that comes out next league that makes a skill that otherwise would be mediocre super awesome. A good example of this is Scourge Arrow of Menace, which appeared on the scene and immediately took over the league start meta. I suspect if it's not nerfed in any way, it's going to be one of the most expensive gems come next league start. You can play it as poison, you can play it as hit-based, you can play it as pretty much anything you want, and it does pretty okay. I bet it's even decent as a cast-on crit trigger. Just make sure to have an arrow nova for the juicy single target overlaps. But I've already talked about that quite a bit, both last week and in a dedicated video, which I'll link up in the card and down below if you want to check it out. So today, I'm going to talk about new skills taking over the meta, which I haven't yet talked about. But this is far from an exhaustive list. We are 2 weeks in, and I'm sure more is going to come out in the future. Therefore, if you want to know about all the hottest meta-breaking builds, do be sure to get subscribed, leave a like while you're down there, maybe put down below in the comments the build that you most want to see break the meta, and let's get into it with the 5 that I've found so far. Starting with number 1, a brand new bossing build, Penance brand of Dissipation. This restores a lot of the old behavior of Penance brand, but with brand new scaling. You know, like the super fast tick rates. It's every 0.06 seconds while attached, so you will need a fairly high amount of attacking cast speed, which is why we see so many builds going power charge stacking with Badge of Brotherhood. They then convert all the damage to cold, put on a heat shiver, toss it in a Dialis for more hit damage against the branded enemy, and you've got yourself a really cool boss killer that does a lot of damage, kind of fails at clearing maps a lot of the times since it doesn't have that much AoE until it's ramped up, absolutely blasts through Sanctum, and is often a glass cannon. Yeah, this setup is very much an acquired taste, but it's a cool way to combine a lot of very powerful mechanical synergies. You have the Penance brand itself, which needs a little bit of time to ramp up, but deals more and more damage each time it pulses. It's very different from the old Penance brand in that before, Penance brand did nothing, built up energy, and then pulsed or exploded at the end. Now, it builds up energy while pulsing, so your damage just ramps, thing dies. Usually you won't even get to 20 stacks. It's why you don't see too many people running the triple remarkable that used to be mandatory as kind of a point of entry for Penance brand builds. Now here we've got a Slayer, but I've seen it on Occultist and Assassin as well. Really anything that you can use to get damage via the Malachai's Loop and Ralakash's Impatience for stacking all of the charges. You get a ton of frenzies, you get a ton of endurance, and you get a ton of power. And the reason that I wanted to highlight this version in particular is because they're doing some interesting things with the Graven Secret. Basically, they're getting modifiers to absorption charges in place of power charges, which completely changes the build's dynamic. Now, I'll admit, usually when I look at one of these POVs, I kind of know what's going on, or I guess characters on PoE Ninja. In this one, I really don't know too much of what's going on, and that's why it's so cool to me. I'm definitely going to have to look around, maybe talk to someone who's played it, see how the Gravens feels, or even if this should be a thing. But it could be a way to take what is traditionally a pure glass cannon and turn it into something that isn't nearly so glassy. It probably won't tank Uber Boss slams, but it's got a ton of endurance charges, a ton of absorption charges, and could actually survive a hit or two. The other cool setup that I've seen with this, and this is probably why the build is about 2% in the meta right now, or builds, a much higher budget, much higher barrier to entry, nebulous, max res stacking, Penance brand of Dissipation Pathfinder. I am not the biggest fan of glass cannon builds, so I like it when people are adding interesting defenses, such as using the Defiance of Destiny amulet, which if you saw my Scourge Arrow video, you'd know is really good, especially on Pathfinder where you can throw in a Progenesis, though we don't see one here. So this is another way to play it, but I would say this is exclusively high budget, whereas a lot of these setups, once you have the Dialas, the Heat Shivers, etc., I mean, you're kind of just assembling unique items, so if a barrier to entry is a bit lower, I personally would not play the nebulous version without a Mage Blood. Very cool though. I like to see Penance Brand in play. I'm probably going to mess around with some version of Penance Brand. I don't know if it's going to be Dissipation or Vanilla at some point soon. I was going to Wisp League, and I still may, but there's so many cool and awesome things that I could try that I don't want to just hard commit to. I am definitely doing that next. I am working on a next build. I have no idea what it is. I just finished farming with currency, and so who knows? Maybe it's going to be Penance Brand. Maybe it's going to be something else. Get subscribed if you want to find out, because I'm going to be talking about it in the near future. Then next up, a great way to do a lot of damage on a budget. Though I do have to put a big warning here. This is a Ball Lightning of Static build. Now, Ball Lightning of Static has 3 cooldown uses, 1.5 second cooldown each. If you put that on a totem, you have 3 totems you can summon, each of which summon 3 Ball Lightning of Static, essentially multiplying your total cooldown uses, or kind of bypassing the cooldown altogether. Maybe you could consider it 300% more cooldown recovery rate. Either way, I don't know if GGG is going to fix this. I don't know if they're saying, okay, this is cool, this is awesome, people love it, or if they're saying, oh no, this is a problem, we need to get rid of this ASAP. So, if you're going to try this build, be warned, it could just be deleted in a hotfix. But they haven't fixed it so far, and they haven't said anything, so you also could be good. And who knows, if you're going to fix it at the end of the league, then now's the time to play it before it goes away forever. This whole interaction is really cool. And as you can see, this is pretty good gear overall, but we're on week 2, so nothing super crazy. And in fact, in comparison to the setup that I was just talking about, wearing a Mage Blood with a Nebulous, I mean, this is just downright easy to find gear. I know the Ashes looks crazy. It's only like 3 Divines last I checked. And sure, maybe this one's well rolled, so it's a little more, but maybe not. It did get a pretty significant nerf, and with the gem quality changes, you don't need Ashes for your build to feel complete. I especially like the Algor Mortis here, where enemies in your chilling areas take increased lightning damage, and you also have a chance to sap them. Not only does it add a nice layer of defense, effectively equal to Fortify, but it adds a good bit of damage as well, and gives you non-damaging ailment effect. That's not quite as easy to create a chilling zone as it used to be. Before, you could just put Vortex on left click. Here we've got a nice little Arcanist brand support with Creeping Frost that's also throwing Assassin's Mark. You get a mark, you get a mark, you get a mark on all the enemies. Of course, we're Primalist for Charms. We've got Suppression. These are pretty affordable. Cooldown recovery rate scales your damage. I was about to say I'd expect to see it on belts as well, and maybe even boots. Okay, not on boots, except for the implicit. I would guess a more endgamey version would actually have cooldown recovery boots as well. Then again, maybe not. Maybe the action speed is in fact better. It would also be way more expensive to get suppression and cooldown recovery, so you'd either have to give up the Algor Mortis or get significantly better suppression rolls between here and the charms. Remember, a lot of things about builds in Path of Exile are flexible, and that's especially the case with the charms, where you get a ton of extra options. It's all about shifting one thing from here to there, then from there back to here, until you get something that you're happy with. Part of the reason that this build is relatively budget and easy to play is you take advantage of Hierophant's defenses and damage scaling via totems. As long as you're playing totems, Hierophant's going to feel really good. And while this doesn't have necessarily a ton of armor, it does have an absolutely massive health pool of almost 8,000. I mean, it's not quite like that, because certain times the damage is going to be split, or I guess skewed a little bit by the energy shield, but let's just say it's about 8,000, and then it's 7,500 once the energy shield gets blown away. You've still got a really nice balance of life and mana. You've got all that juicy Mind Over Matter effect, which, wait, maybe we don't have Mind Over Matter effect, so maybe they have just a little bit more mana than life. Sorry, my mistake. I was looking at a lot of setups, and quite a few were taking Divine Guidance instead of, let's see, I think it was Arcane Blessing they were dropping actually, which tells me that this build has significant damage if people are dropping Arcane Blessing. 81% have Arcane Blessing, about 20% don't. There's a lot of really cool options. While this starts out as a budget build, I bet if I click through here, eventually going to find someone who is absolutely decked out. Here we've got more of an energy shield scaling setup. Probably got a really nice juicy arcane cloak. Oh yeah, that's going to add so much damage. We've got a... we're an Annihilating Light setup. This is another way to go. It adds a lot of damage, but this version is going to be, let's just say, a little bit squishier than some of the others. Again, though, that all varies based on your own personal comfort. Actually, are they even capping their res? This might be a no-res build, in which case, rather than just a little squishier, it would be in... Oh, never mind. See, this league, it's so hard to tell what builds are doing. Charms. They have all their res on charms. And yes, I am clicking through and looking at stuff. I had a build picked out before, but the last couple things that I've looked at, like this setup, I didn't plan for that at all. I just thought it would be cool to share, and that's kind of the idea behind these videos. I don't want to superscript stuff. It's going to be a little more off the cuff. Sometimes I will get things wrong, in which case I encourage you to be respectful, but correct me down in the comments. Let me know. Be like, hey, this is how this works. But overall, I hope it keeps things a little more fun and informative. Then last up, Righteous Fire, a build that was a Path of Exile staple, at least until this league. Now, I do think Righteous Fire is still playable. It's just bad in comparison to what it once was, which of course leads to a massive drop in the skill's play rate. But we got something really cool. That is Righteous Fire of Arcane Devotion. Instead of scaling based on your life, it scales based on your mana. And modifiers to spell damage apply to the skill's damage over time effect. One thing that always made Righteous Fire notoriously difficult to scale was the fact that spell damage modifiers did not apply. You could only get elemental damage, or fire, or damage over time, or fire dot multi. But now you can use spell damage, same as Fire Trap, which means you can use Indigon. And because you're already a mana stacker, that leads to absolutely terrible, terrifying setups. And I mean terrible in a good way, by the way. Not as in it's a bad build, as in it's terrible to be standing next to this when they start ramping their mana because you are going to get burned. And here we have damage over time multiplier, mana, fire damage, everything you'd want on a scepter. It's a really nice scepter, by the way. We've got our Indigon with life regen, Ivory Tower, so you reserve life with your Prism Guardian and get an absolutely absurd energy shield pool. Plus, you're stacking intelligence. Stacking intelligence means that you can use Shaper's Touch. Plus, you also stack strength, and are we stealing anything? We are not even stealing a Flesh and Flame, though that would be another option. There's plenty of good nodes between Guardian and Inquisitor. I'm guessing it's just that between mana and energy shield, jewels are too much of a premium. Yep, intelligence mana, that makes sense. So strength gives mana, intelligence gives energy shield, intelligence gives mana, intelligence gives accuracy, which doesn't actually matter here. And you also get energy shield per strength. So stack up a bunch of int, a good bit of strength, and you end up with 24,000 energy shield. And unlike an energy blade build that then cuts that in half and has to survive on that health pool, no, we've just got 24.6k. The other cool thing about this build is it gets a lot of regen from chevrons. You regenerate 6% of your energy shield per second. And if your energy shield ends up outscaling your mana, which we do have here, you're burning based on your mana, but you're recovering based on your energy shield. Therefore, this makes it a little bit easier to scale your recovery than if the same thing, your energy shield or your life, was determining both the burn and the scaling. Let's see, we've got a helical ring. Very, very nice. Minus prefixes. Who needs those anyway? Just get even more mana, which with damage taken recouped. Oh yeah, that's a great way to recover. Enemies will hit you and it'll just feed you practically infinite mana, which lets you ramp your Indigon. We've got a good old Scorching Ray with infused channeling, casual channeling. Oh, that's so funny. Oh, it's a nice Great Wolf. Attributes mana. That's sweet. Yeah, this is a really cool setup. We've even got a Vol Impurity of Fire, which I bet is getting used. And then Frostblink for getting around. Cast while channeling Cyclone. Good old Abyssal Jewel. Gotta add that extra mana on. Yep. That is a very cool setup. And the second you hit your Arcane Cloak, you just ramp your Indigon insanely. You get a ton of spell damage. And then that spell damage, bam, instantly turns into damage. I bet this dot caps itself in no time. So yeah, Righteous Fire of Arcane Devotion. Very cool build. Looks pretty fun. Might play it at some point. Probably not this league, though. And so we'll see if the setup survives the loss of charms, because they do give a lot of value. These regen life over a second from Guardian, super, super underrated charm. Actually awesome to play with. I'm definitely going to try to work at least one of those into a build at some point in the future. Something else cool that I do want to finally talk about. You get recovery from mana flasks as life. Your coruscating elixir burns off your life to recover energy shield. So you're constantly nuking what life you have to get energy shield, which then gives you more life because you're also recovering mana. And you're basically never going to die to chaos damage, even if the coruscating elixir goes down, because you have a lot of mana, and you're definitely not going to get any chaos damage that's burning through it. So yeah, pretty neat setup, and I look forward to seeing what people do with this in the future. Now, I've talked about a few builds that are starting to get known in the meta, either because they're being played by content creators, or simply because they're very good and a lot of people have picked them up. What about things that aren't necessarily getting as much attention? There's two things I want to talk about, which may end up developing into something in the future, or may not. Starting with Rage Vortex of Berserking, which is being played as an Ellie stacker and a lot more as a Strength stacker. Now, you can play Strength stacker as Berserker, or you can play Strength stacker as Juggernaut. Personally, I've always preferred the Juggernaut version, because I find it's easier to steal the Berserker node and have infinite defenses than have infinite damage and be struggling for your defenses because you're wearing all unique items. This build has always felt a bit like assembling Exodia, because you put on your Iron Fortress, then you put on your replica Alberon's Warpath, and you put on your Red Blade banner, and all of a sudden you have yourself a build. Without these three things, your build kind of doesn't function. You need this to enable Battle Mage's Cry, you need this to get the base scaling up, and you need this for your base damage. That way, strength is your flat damage, your increased damage, and oh yeah, it's also your accuracy. And if you're a Jug, or if you're stealing the Jug node, which this setup is not, it's also your attack speed, and in some cases it can be your crit because you're getting increased crit strike chance per strength, and with 2000 strength, that actually adds up to a pretty significant amount of crit. Oh, and then we doubled it because Paradoxica. So overall, very, very cool. Now, this isn't necessarily the setup that I would go with personally. It looks very strong. It has a lot of DPS. But the other thing is, Rage Vortex of Berserking eats your rage. So I would actually be looking for a setup with a tincture that gives rage on hit. The assumption that I have there, based on my own experiences, using one on Scourgear of Menace, is you get a bunch of rage by hitting enemies. Oh, I know this guy. I've definitely talked about him before. He plays Rage Vortex or something similar pretty much every league. It looks like he is doing self-curse shenanigans this time. That's how he's getting his rage generation. That's definitely an interesting way to go. And Starforge for damage. The tincture, as long as you have enough enemies to hit, pretty much feels like it gives infinite rage, and this is why I don't think I'm quite ready to talk about this as a build, because there's a lot of exploration here. My tincture idea could actually be the best way to play it, or it could be a bad way to play it, and maybe I'll try it, maybe I'll try something else. Either way, it's interesting, and I think you should keep it on your radar. The other thing I wanted to talk about is this. A cast on crit, Ice Nova of Frostbolts, with Cost Breeze, with a Blizzard Crown, a Prism Guardian. Like, if you told me that we were actually in 3.14 rather than 3.23, I'd kind of believe you looking at this. It's crazy to me that so little about this build has changed, even though it's something that people haven't played that much for years, and now all of a sudden it's back. Cast and Crit Ice Nova always abused the fact that when you cast an Ice Nova on a Frostbolt, it could overlap. If you had 2 projectiles, you got 2 overlaps. With Ice Nova of Frostbolts, though, you want 4 projectiles because you can get 4 overlaps. Now, I don't exactly know how much AoE you need to get 4 overlaps, and it probably also depends on your range from the enemy. If you're really close, all the projectiles start really close together, and they probably overlap 100% of the time. Whereas the farther you get, the more it becomes about a clearing skill, and the less it becomes about a pure single target nuke everything down with overlap skill. But it is absolutely crazy to me that here we have a build that's basically straight out of, 2020, 2019, with almost no changes, and it looks like it still works. Is it going to be the tankiest thing? I mean, no, but that's why we wear a Headhunter. That was always why you wore a Headhunter on that build. And it probably plays exactly like you remember. Though I am curious if people will start to put together slightly more budget setups, and who knows, maybe I'll explore a variant myself. It probably won't be Assassin, but we'll just have to see. Also, if anyone watched my recent video where I broke down how I made roughly 200 divines, and you're wondering, how hard is it to sell stuff? Well, here's a quick random update from a trade that I happened to get while recording this. I'm selling the Eyes of a Great Wolf for 19 divines. I've sold most of the stuff off. There's a couple things that I decided to just keep. There's a couple things that I'm going to use. But overall, I have 164 divines in raw divines, and then another roughly 20-ish divines in chaos. That's about 184 out of a 200 already sold. And I'm sure I could get most of the rest of the value of that last 10-ish%, a little less, if I kept selling things off. But for example, I've kept all my sextants because I might want to use them. That's a few divines and sextants. I think 4 or 5. I've kept some of the scarabs, etc., etc. So it was overall pretty easy to sell. And I know this isn't quite what you came for, but sometimes cool opportunities happen and I want to share. And so those are my thoughts on some Transfigured Gems to watch. Wretch's Fire of Arcane Devotion, Rage Vortex of Berserking, Penance Brand of Dissipation, Ball Lightning of Static Totems, and Ice Nova of Frostbolts. But there is one more topic that I wanted to talk about quickly today, which is that Wisp Farming is getting a little bit closer to solved. In short, when you enter the Viridian Wildwood, it's totally okay to go slow. In fact, it's better to go slow than fast. You only have a limited amount of light, which is distance traveled, not time spent. And if you can get, say, 4,000 total wisps, the amount of value that you get is exponentially higher than if you leave with only 1,000 or 2,000. Now, sometimes you will get unlucky and it's going to be more difficult. But most of the time, when I'm able to get 4,000, I'll get multiple divines in value, be it from a puzzle box drop, a couple raw divines just dropping on the floor, or a bunch of small stuff all adding up. Of course, in addition to this, you want to use League mechanics to boost as many rare monsters as possible in your maps, or as many monsters with quantity and rarity bonuses as you can find. Most of these come in the form of things like possession or monster rarity. And if you want to know more, we just finished a full Affliction farming guide written by Grimro over at Maxwell GG, which I'll link down below. And speaking of, if you want to read more about the meta report or the builds that I just talked about, I also go over them at Maxwell GG. But remember, this is all a work in progress. The meta is still unfolding, and while I do think several of these builds have a lot of potential and will absolutely disrupt the meta in different ways, it's definitely not solved, and a newcomer that I haven't heard of, you haven't heard of, maybe someone down below has heard of, will come out of nowhere and absolutely blast the competition. And so I'm curious, do you think there's any super awesome ultimate meta-breaking builds that will come out of nowhere and completely crush stuff? Let me know, and who knows, maybe it'll be featured next week in episode 3. But for now, I'd like to take a moment to thank my patrons and channel members. For as low as $1 a month, you can help make videos just like this one possible. Personally, I have a lot of fun exploring the meta, looking at different builds, looking at stuff that I know that I can help explain and educate you about, or for me personally, it's even more fun to look at stuff and I go, wait a minute, I don't know why they're doing that. Why are they doing that? Because that's awesome and I love learning about this game. So if you also like learning, thank you for watching to the end. Hopefully I see you soon, and enjoy the Affliction League meta because it's been fresher than really any time in the game's recent history.